After studying this module, you shall be able to describe the learning processes and explaining about what learning is all about. You will also understand about the Pavlov who discovered classical conditioning. You will be able to describe behaviors that are learned and unlearned in classical conditioning. You will also learn the applications of classical conditioning in our everyday life. From the day we are born, we begin with processes of learning that last throughout our life. Today, learning holds a very important place in psychology. Important concepts of learning are seen in numerous areas of psychology, such as cognitive psychology, in education psychology, as in social and in developmental psychology. Learning can help in understanding our everyday life behaviors. We are born knowing how to perform certain behaviors such as breathing, sneezing and coughing. Learning can, however, modify even these biological programmed responses. People can learn, for example, to cover their mouths when they sneeze or cough. So, let us have an understanding of the word learning and its definition. The term learning may be defined as learning in which we acquire new knowledge or skill. Even a small child proudly tells others that he knows how to tie his shoes. But now learning is viewed as a process rather than a collection of factual and procedural knowledge. A more useful definition as follows: learning is any relatively permanent change in behavior brought about by experience or practice. So, by this definition, there are three things which we can cover out here, that learning is relatively permanent. It refers to any changes in behavior due to our experience. Researchers have also suggested that once people learn something, it is always present somewhere or the other in their memory. We can also understand with the definition that learning is through experience or practice. Learning depends on the experience of people also. Painful or noxious experiences are not forgotten easily and tend to last for a lifetime. Does all changes lead to learning? This is another aspect which we can understand through the definition. No, it is not possible that all changes can be accomplished through learning. Some changes can take place through maturation also. As you grow, there would be certain changes which would be emerging through your genetic setup. Let us try and focus on some important elements or terms in learning. First is the stimulus and second is the response. Before we discuss the concept, what stimulus is, concept of classical and operant conditioning, let us understand what is a stimulus, because this word will be coming again and again in our modules. Stimulus may be defined as anything which is being perceived through our senses, which could be an object, an event or an experience that causes some kind of a response from your side. Stimulus can be very simple. It could be you can use it could be bell, it could be light, it could be tone, anything, or a complex one, that is text in books, lectures also. So, this is stimulus. Now, what is the response? Response is any activity of the muscle or other identifiable behaviors. Therefore, it is the reaction of an organism to some event or situation. What kind of a response you give to a situation? When if you are sleeping and light is switched on, that is a stimulus. So, what kind of a response would be there? Blinking of eyes. So, this would be your response. Now, let us try and understand what classical conditioning is. It has been seen that psychology's major focus was on the mental activity till earlier 90s, the mental activity till early 1900s. Which was a cause of dissatisfaction for many research scientists. Till then also they were not able to achieve the goal of objectivity or scientific basis of research to the field of psychology. The result for achieving this goal was accomplished by not a psychologist, by a Russian physiologist, Ivan Pavlov, who studied the working of the body. He won a Nobel Prize in 1904 for his work, where he scientifically studied the digestive system of the dogs. It was another discovery, though, that made him famous in the field of psychology. Pavlov found that putting food powder on a dog's tongue would lead to response from the dog in the form of salivation. This was due to salivary glands that would automatically start releasing saliva to help in chewing and digestion. This is a normal reflex which is present in both humans and animals. Pavlov soon started to notice that the dog not only started to salivate when the food was presented to them, but also at the sight of the food led to this kind of a response. That meant that dog was starting to salivate even before he put the food powder on his tongue. He concluded that the dogs were learning to respond to stimuli other than the food powder. Pavlov spent rest of his life in studying these concepts, which are known as Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning. To better understand the basic concept of classical conditioning, let's look at the observations studied by Pavlov in his experiment. Before conditioning, food was presented, which is termed as your unconditioned stimulus, and the response of the dog was salivation, that is unconditioned response. That was before conditioning. When we had introduced a stimuli out here before conditioning, bell is termed as a neutral stimulus, which will lead to no conditioned response, that is no salivation was there. During conditioning, we had seen that bell was there, which was paired with food, and an unconditioned response was generated, which was salivation. After conditioning, after we had gone through this number of trials, we could see that bell was now a conditioned stimulus, which led to a conditioned response of salivation. So, what is before conditioning? As Pavlov observed his dog, he found out that there should be a stimulus present which can simultaneously or automatically trigger a reflexive response. Since no learning is involved in the relationship between that stimulus and the corresponding response, both the stimulus and the response are considered unconditioned out here. In the experiment, US is the food, which reflexity triggers UR, that is your salivation. In addition, before conditioning occurs, neutral stimulus must be presented to the organism. In the picture, when the bell, that is the neutral stimulus, is rung, no salivation was occurring. During conditioning, what had happened? When conditioning is initiated, the neutral stimulus will be presented together with the unconditioned, that is unconditioned stimulus. As shown in the image, the bell is presented with the food, which leads to salivation. With repeated pairings, we could see that organism will learn to create a connection between neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. After conditioning, what we had seen, that US becomes US unconditioned stimulus becomes conditioned stimulus, and unconditioned response becomes your conditioned response, as they are both products of the process of conditioning. Now, let us see what are the different elements in classical conditioning. During the study of Pavlov had identified some key elements that are important for conditioning to take place. These are unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that elicits a response before any conditioning has occurred. In the case food served as unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned response, that is UCR, a reflex response elicited by an unconditioned stimulus. For example, food given to the dog is the UCS and the salivation to the food is your UCR. Conditioned stimulus, that is the CS, a stimulus that elicits a response after being paired with an unconditioned stimulus. In this study, the sound of the bell will not elicit the same response until conditioning takes place. And last is the conditioned response, that is the CR, a response elicited by a conditioned stimulus. Salivation to the CR, the salivation to the conditioned stimulus, the bell, is called the conditioned response. Some basic principles or important aspects in classical conditioning after understanding the key concepts or key elements are: the CS must come before the UCS, and the CS and UCS must be very close together in time. The interval should not be larger enough. The neutral stimulus must be paired with the UCS for several times. The CS, which has been decided to achieve conditioning, must be distinctive or stands out in order to elicit a response. Now, the role of conditioning in our emotional response. Let's look at the famous experiment which was done on human to assess their behavior. It showed that even an emotional response could be conditioned. Conditioned emotional responses showed that conditioned emotional responses are some of the easiest forms of classical conditioning to accomplish. Our lives are full of these examples or full of these emotions that can be conditioned. For example, fear, dentist chairs, advertisements also use people or objects to generate such emotional responses towards those products. If you take an example of Hero Honda, they basically deal with the emotional aspect of your culture, where they have in the ads they show the relationships of how youth basically bow their head in front of elders. The Indian culture is being basically covered in that ad. For emotional conditional response, and a famous experiment was also can also be taken out here. It is about little Albert and the rat. John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, believed that behavior could be explained in terms of learning. He demonstrated a classical experiment which involved a small child called little Albert, but referred as little Albert in this experiment, Albert B. According to Watson, infants were not naturally afraid of animals. So, fear response was being generated where Albert was conditioned to fear rats when a loud noise was being generated. When the rat used to come close to the little Albert, a loud hammer noise was produced, so that the fear of rats was being generated in little Albert. About acquisition. Acquisition is the pairing of pairing the unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus causes the acquisition of the response to the conditioned stimulus, and this is called acquisition. Remember, the unconditioned stimulus is one that naturally evokes the UCR. After pairing the CS and the UCS repeatedly, the CS alone will come to evoke the response, which is now known as the CR. A delay between presentation of the conditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus might not lead to association between the two. Next is stimulus generalization. The tendency to respond to a stimulus that is only similar to original conditioned stimulus. Animals trained to respond to a particular stimulus will respond to that stimulus only, and other similar stimuli will not be attended towards. Stimulus discrimination. If the animal responds to one stimulus but not to another, we say that discrimination has taken place, where they are able to discriminate between two similar stimuli. Extinction. In classical conditioning, the response will get weaker and weaker if you present the CS over and over again without the US. That is, your food is not presented, then extinction will take place. Spontaneous recovery. Reappearance of a learned response following apparent conditioning will be taken. That is, spontaneous recovery is the reappearance of a response that had been extinguished, where food, again if you present the food, that response will start coming. Applications of classical conditioning, where all we can apply classical conditioning in our day-to-day life, that is phobias. Fear that persists even when no realistic danger exists is known as phobia. By using principles of classical conditioning, a therapeutic technique was developed for treating any such phobia. This technique was first developed by Wolpe. Wolpe believed that the link between CS and the US must be broken in order for the therapies to work. So, to follow up from the lightning example for the therapy to work, the link between the lightning and the thunder has to be broken down. Systematic desensitization is based on the principle of classical conditioning also, and it was developed by Mary Cover Jones in 1924 to help a boy named Peter who was terrified of rabbits. To help Peter get over his fear of rabbit, Jones planned to have a rabbit present while Peter ate his meals. She hoped that Peter's fear of rabbit would go through extinction and that he would come to have the same positive feelings for the rabbit that he had towards food. Next is biological preparedness. Biological preparedness is the idea that people and animals are inherently inclined to form association between certain stimuli and responses. This concept plays an important role in learning, particularly in understanding the classical conditioning processes. Biological preparedness and classical conditioning, also a great example of this can be with the work of classical conditioning process is the development of taste aversions. Have you ever eaten something and then gotten sick afterwards? You try and associate that food with your sickness and you will blame it. That chances are probably good that you avoid eating that particular food every time, because then an association which you had found, it would lead to food poisoning. So, after studying this module, let's see what you have learned. We can summarize it by saying that learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. The three basic kinds of learnings are classical conditioning, operant conditioning and observational learning, and we have covered here is classical conditioning. While studying digestion in dogs, Pavlov learned if neutral stimulus is repeatedly paired with unconditional stimulus that already elicits the unconditioned response, the neutral stimulus will come to elicit the same response. And Watson demonstrated the conditioning process in human beings in the classical experiment with little Albert. You had also understood about acquisition, extension, and about how high order conditioning can also take place. Application of classical conditioning is also seen in a wide range of bodily preparedness, including your fears, phobias, systematic desensitization.
Learning is when you learn something. Example, marks obtained in a test. Learning is termed as relatively permanent. By this, we mean that once people learn something, it is always present somewhere in the memory. Experience also plays an important role in learning, as painful or noxious experiences are not forgotten easily and tend to last for a lifetime. It has also been seen that some changes takes place through maturation and not only through learning. Therefore, any kind of change in the way an organism behaves is learning. Before we discuss the concepts of classical and operant conditioning, it becomes necessary to understand the terms of stimulus and response. Stimulus may be defined as anything which is being perceived through our senses, which could be any object, event, or experience that causes response. Response is any activity of the muscles or other identifiable behaviors. Therefore, it is the reaction of an organism to some event or situation. Let us now understand the concept of classical conditioning. It is defined as learning to make a reflex response to a stimulus other than the original natural stimulus that normally produces it. It was the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov who first identified the mechanism of classical conditioning. He won a Nobel Prize in 1904 for his work, where he scientifically studied the digestive system of a canine. The image here shows the setup of his experiment. Pavlov found that putting food powder on a dog's tongue would lead to a response from the dog in a form of salivation. This was due to salivary glands that would automatically start releasing saliva to help in chewing and digestion. This is a normal reflex which is present in both humans and animals. Pavlov soon started to notice that dogs started salivating before the food was presented to them, or even at the sight of the food. That means dogs were starting to salivate before he put the food powder on their tongues. He concluded that the dogs were learning to respond to stimuli other than the food powder. During the study, Pavlov had identified some key elements that are important for conditioning to take place. These are as follows: unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that elicits a response before any conditioning has occurred. In this case, food served as unconditioned stimulus. Conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that elicits a response after being paired with an unconditioned stimulus. The sound of a bell is the conditioned stimulus. Unconditioned response, an innate response elicited by an unconditioned stimulus, usually either a reflex or an emotional response. For example, food given to the dogs is the unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation to the food is the unconditioned response. Conditioned response, a response elicited by a conditioned stimulus. Salivation to the conditioned stimulus, the bell, is called the conditioned response. To better understand the basic concepts of classical conditioning, let us look at the observations studied by Pavlov on his dog. Stage 1: Before conditioning. In this stage, the unconditioned stimulus produces an unconditioned response in an organism. In basic terms, this means that a stimulus in the environment, that is food, has produced a behavior response which is unlearned, unconditioned, and therefore is a natural response, that is salivating, which has not been taught. This stage also involves another stimulus which has no effect on a person and is called the neutral stimulus, that is, the bell. The neutral stimulus could be a person, object, place, etc. The neutral stimulus in classical conditioning does not produce a response until it is paired with the unconditioned stimulus. Stage 2: During conditioning. During this stage, a stimulus which produces no response, that is neutral, in this case bell, is associated with the unconditioned stimulus, that is food, at which point it now becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the dog starts salivating at the sound of the bell only. Stage 3: After conditioning. Now the conditioned stimulus, that is bell, has been associated with the unconditioned stimulus, that is salivation, to create a new conditioned response, that is salivate. Let us now understand some of the important principles involved in classical conditioning. They are: acquisition. In acquisition, pairing the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus causes the acquisition of the response to the conditioned stimulus. Example: blinking of eyes when air is blown. Extinction. In extinction, the response will get weaker and weaker if we present the conditioned stimulus over and over without the unconditioned stimulus. For example, when Pavlov stopped giving food with the bell, the dog soon stopped salivating at the ringing of the bell. Spontaneous recovery. It is the reappearance of a response, a conditioned response, that has been extinguished. This is referred as spontaneous because the response seems to appear out of nowhere. The graph here shows all the important elements involved in classical conditioning, and also shows a response being acquired going through extinction and bouncing back during spontaneous recovery after a rest period. Other important principles in classical conditioning are stimulus generalization. It is a tendency to respond to a stimulus that is only similar to the original conditioned stimulus. For example, Pavlov had conditioned dog to the sound of a bell, but when dog hears a sound similar to that, he was not able to differentiate and will respond to that tone. Stimulus discrimination. If the animal responds to one stimulus but not to another, we say that the animal is discriminating between the two stimuli. This is called discrimination. Discrimination is the opposite of generalization. Till now, we have understood about classical conditioning, but it also becomes important to know where all it can be applied in our everyday life. It can be used in situations where fear persists even when no realistic danger exists. This is called phobia. It is an intense, unrealistic, irrational fear of a specific situation or object. Example, arachnophobia, fear of spiders. It is also used to evoke conditioned emotional response, a learned emotional reaction to a previously neutral stimulus. Example, dentist's chair. Last but not the least is the systematic desensitization. It is exposing phobic people gradually to feared stimuli while they stay calm and relaxed to treat phobia. In this module, we have learned about learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. In classical conditioning, an unconditioned stimuli, food, that already elicits the unconditioned response, salivation, the neutral stimulus will come to elicit the same response. We also discussed about principles involved in classical conditioning, namely acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. Classical conditioning has applications in the areas of systematic desensitization to overcome phobia and in the area of emotional responses.